Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of process-based flow control. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by process-based flow control, what are the various roles of operational activities that have been undertaken in process-based flow control, and lastly, describe the process-based flow control and operations management. Now let's begin with our learning. The process-based flow control, that is a set or series of activities that have been undertaken in a business organization with respect to a set of series that needs to be undertaken. A control flow diagram, that is CFD, is a diagram that depicts about how a business process, procedures or review needs to be controlled. So with the help of various diagrams, with the help of various signs, or with the help of certain depictions, we can easily understand about how an activity needs to be controlled or how the activity needs to be undertaken. The control flow diagram, that is CFD, were invented in the year 1950s and now extensively used as a part of various technical fields. So along with the flow charts, the various DRACON charts, data flow diagrams, functional flow block diagrams, Gantt charts, and PERT diagrams, that is program evaluation review technique diagrams, are one of the most used business process modeling approaches, which can be used as a part of a process flow diagram. So in this particular case or a particular consideration, on the right hand side, the learners can see that the various symbols and signs have been provided. So arrow which has been in a downward position or a downward moving consideration, it shows of a beginning of a certain activity or beginning or a end of a certain activity or certain operations. A rectangle or a particular square shows you a certain consideration about a particular activity that has been undertaken. The arrow, which is not of a bold consideration, but which is of a very smaller consideration, and it is not colored in a dark consideration, is called as a process flow diagram. The diamond shape or a particular inverted or square shape of a particular product is or a particular design is a part of a component of a decision. Another shape that you can see in this particular case is a part of a delay. And lastly, a particular type of a paper that has been shown is a depiction or a particular consideration which shows as a part of a document. So these are the various process-based flow diagrams or control charts on which basis we can identify about which activity is being undertaken and what processes are being followed in a business organization. Now let's understand what are the various procedures or activities that have been performed in case of a process flow control or a diagram. So the data link control, the process flow diagram or a control flow chart is been controlled with major three activities: the link discipline, the flow chart, and the error control. So with the link discipline understands or deals with about who should send the data to a certain consideration. So the participants or the respondents who have been authorized or who have been having a certain control to link a particular document or who is responsible for sending a certain document is the consideration of linking the discipline. The second perspective that has been associated is with respect of flow control, wherein how much data should be sent. So in this particular consideration, one needs to consider and understand about what should be the amount of data that is either in a quantitative and qualitative terms about what should be the amount of data that should be sent from one end to other end. The error control activity focuses on how can errors be detected and it can be corrected within a particular flowchart or within a particular process or in certain activity. So the error control chart focuses on how we can detect the particular errors, and when those particular data are being detected and they have been identified, how those particular errors can be corrected and it can be identified or it can be assessed in a better consideration. So detection and correction of errors are essentially important and needs to be undertaken in a very better and effective way. Now let's understand what is the procedure or activities that needs to be performed for a differential pressure transmitter. So for a differential pressure transmitter, what we need to do is initially we need to set a point for a certain transmitter, that is the flow of current or flow of water from one level to another level. So when we have a flow of activity in a circular diagram, it has been also shown as a particular single arrow, which is always showing a flow of activity or a series that is in a direction which is been moving from the left hand side towards the right hand side. The positive and negative notes show that in what way those particular activity or circular level is been moving and what is the flow of current or a flow of water in that particular consideration. The second perspective is the square or a rectangular perspective, which is showing a part of a controller. Then we have the next perspective is the flapper, the nozzle, the arrangements. Then we have the pneumatic control valve, and lastly, we have a flow process. So in this way, in a particular arrangement or sequential order, the process or procedure activity that can be performed for a differential pressure transmitter has been undertaken, and all set of series of activities have been undertaken for a particular product or a particular series or a particular activity. Now, this particular event or this particular diagram shows you about in a banking industry or a flow or a control chart, how those activities are being undertaken. So we have various activities that have been related to the sequential flow of activities for a payment method identifier, where we can have either a gateway decision, we can have a sequential flow, we can have an initial event, we can have a task, a cash or a checkbook that we need to accept, or what we need to do, that is a check or a balances, payment method, process of credit cards, and so on. So preparing the package for the customers, and lastly, the final event. So how each and every one single activity has been connected with one another, and how one activity gets completed and the other activity commences, or simultaneously 2 or 3 activities can be conducted. So this particular diagram or this particular chart shows you how a process flow control chart can be implemented in a banking industry, and various activities can be implemented in a business organization of a banking consideration. So operations planning and scheduling control activities with respect to a banking industry can be understood with this particular diagram. Now let's understand what are the various types of process flow diagram. The first type of process flow diagram is a block flow diagram. The second is the flow sheet. The third is the process flow chart. And the fourth or the fifth is the top flow down flow chart and the schematic flow chart diagram. So these are the various different types of flow diagram in which we can draw various diagrams as to show or portray how the activity or the series of activities is been flowing in a business organization. That is whether it is moving in horizontal way, vertical way, diagonal way, or upward moving, downward movings, and so on. Or various activities can be identified in case of in various directions, that is east, west, north, south, and so on. So in this way, either we can use any type, that is a block diagram, block flow, flow chart, process flow, top-down flow, and a schematic flow diagram. And it can be implemented in the business organization to identify the process or flow of activities in the manufacturing unit or a certain consideration. Now let's understand what are the various different type of flows. So dampers have been used to modulate airflow in a response to temperature or pressure changes. They modify the flow of liquid and gases to adjust the pressure, temperature, level, or flow. So in a particular consideration where we need to identify the flow of temperature, flow of air in a particular consideration, then we use the various dampers, and dampers have also been used to modulate the airflow in a particular response. And from those considerations, we need to understand as to how the gases are been moving, how the air is been moving, how we need to adjust the pressure, the temperature, the level, the flow, and so on. So in those particular considerations, the different flow can be understood, and from those considerations, the flow of movement of activities can be understood in a business organization or a manufacturing unit. A business flow process diagram is a diagram that depicts a process and manages elements such as activities, deadlines, people involved, and resources that have been required. So in a business organization, when a process flow diagram has been undertaken, one can easily depict and identify about what are the various process activities and elements that have been undertaken, and how those activities and deadlines of the peoples have been involved in resources can be undertaken in better consideration about those series of activities or a sequence of activities. So in that particular way, different flow diagrams for a dampers, that is for calculation of an airflow, or for a business process can be undertaken. The another perspective is the process flow chart. So the process flow chart is a graphical depiction of a business processes in the form of a flow chart. So it's just a correlation or similar to the flow chart, which can be undertaken for a graphical depiction. So on the basis of various graphs, various signs or symbols, the flow chart can be prepared, and accordingly, it can depict as to how those sequence or series of activities can be undertaken. It's also used to acquire a top-down knowledge of how a process works and what stages are involved and what events affect the results, and so on. So it takes into account about how those activities can be implemented, in what way the process or the series or flow of activities can be undertaken in a business organization. And from those considerations, we can use any one of the method, that is a damper method, a business flow chart method, or a process flow chart method. Now let's understand what are the various symbols that have been used in a process diagram or a flow chart diagram. The various symbols that can be used for trying to start the engine. So when we need to start a particular engine, a particular symbol can be used, and accordingly a symbol can be set for a particular starting of a particular engine. The second symbol can be used for running a problem check. So if there is a certain problem that has been associated, and when we need to run a particular problem check, then accordingly a certain symbol can be used for running a problem check, that is an identification or assessment of a certain work. Displaying the alerts if it can't start. So if a particular activity does not start and a particular alert needs to be displayed, then how we can display certain alerts, and accordingly, various symbols can be used for displaying of alerts also for certain emergency, certain messages that need to be shown in terms of a display or a certain alerts. Then those particular symbols or signs can also be used. Disengaging the clutch. So any machine, any material, or any clutch, or any product that needs to be disengaged from a certain activity or a series or flow of activities, then the symbols can be used for disengaging or engaging of a certain activity also. So if any activity needs to be discontinued, then for those considerations also, the disengaging of clutch can also be undertaken. And lastly, for the fifth perspective, that is trying to restart. So if you are trying to restart a certain machine or a certain process or a particular assembly line, then for those particular considerations also, for trying the restarting, various symbols can be used, and it can be identified as to how those symbols can be used. Now let's understand what is the impact of, what is the consideration of control function. So the control function is used in business organization to establish the various standards. So when we want to establish certain amount of standards, then accordingly, the various controls kind of functions can be used, and we can organize the various activities in very established way or in a very controlled way. Measuring the performance. So when we need to measure the performance of a certain activity or a function that has been performed in a business organization or a manufacturing unit or on the shop floor, then for measurement of the performance at a certain periodic level, that is whether the performance is 50%, 80%, 10%, 90%, 100%, and so on. So measurement of a certain performance level, the control function can be used. The next perspective of comparing the actual performance with the standards and identifying any deviations. So when we have a certain resultants as to the actual and the devious standard performance, so when we need to make a comparison and identify what are the various amounts of deviations, the various control functions can be implemented, and the deviations in the standards and actuals can also be calculated. And lastly, determining the reasons for deviations and take corrective actions if it is being made. So if there's an observation of certain deviations, then what are the various reasons for certain deviations? And if we need to implement a certain corrective or the remedial actions for those considerations, then how those particular actions can be implemented and how we can take those corrective actions for the better consideration of the immediate requirement of those actions. So all these things can be implemented in terms of a control function. So a control flow diagram aids in comprehension of a process details, and it demonstrates as to where the control begins and how does it stop. So as well as it also gives you some information about how diverge in a specific instances a process activity can be undertaken. So a process control flow diagram deals with how a certain activities can be undertaken in business organization, and these particular diagrams can be available with a certain amount of software, or it can be available with a type of diagrams that you can draw on a paper or a particular machine. Assuming you are developing a particular software to start a particular machine, what happens if the machine is flooded or if someone of this spark plugs break, then the flow of control is then changed to the other sections of this particular software. So on the basis of this particular software, one can easily identify as to what is the change in the flow of certain activities and how those particular activities can be controlled in a better way. So with those examples and the uses of control flow diagram, we can easily identify and control those activities. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood and learned what do we mean by the process flow based and the control flow based. What are the various plannings that have been required in goods and services with respect to the process based flow control, and how to implement the process based flow control in a business organizations. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning in this particular session. We'll stay connected and we'll continue with our learning. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.